So, hello and welcome. It is 1 o'clock and we are in another breakout session. I am so excited and proud of our next presenter, Stephanie Drenka, who is our Director of Communications for Dallas TRHT, is going to be presenting on Language Matters. I sent her a text the other day and said, "Is there anything you can't do?" And then I answered it myself that said, "Nope." Her list of accomplishments is just astounding. And if you don't know her, you should get to know her. She is absolutely a racial equity champion, advocate, all of those things. She understands communication. She's all about amplifying voices for those voices that are not heard. She has her own amazing stories that she's willing to share with you, and she's willing to take you along the way in being able to share your own. So I promise you that you're going to have an amazing session with her, and I'm going to let her do her thing and be awesome, and look forward to any questions that you all have that come up in the chat. So Stephanie, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Erica, for that impromptu introduction. I thought that I was going to moderate myself and I could breeze over the intro section. So I appreciate her kind words. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so we can all be on the same page. Welcome to Language Matters. I have done a version of this presentation in the past with Jerry Hawkins, our Executive Director. Our previous version, we did storytelling for racial justice, and I have updated the presentation to storytelling for racial healing in honor of the National Day of Racial Healing, which we are commemorating today. As Erica mentioned, I am the Communications Director for Dallas Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Side note, we are now selling our awesome t-shirts at DallasTRHT.org/shop. So if you would like to support us that way, you can also wear an awesome shirt like this. And I don't know, I've been doing some tech stuff in the background, so I'm not sure how many of you got a chance to hear about our mission and our vision. It's on our website, so I won't spend too much time on it. Our mission: to create a radically inclusive city by addressing race and racism through narrative change, relationship building, and equitable policies and practices. So we have this framework that we received from the Kellogg Foundation, but what I really want to focus on today is our first tenet, which is narrative change. The reason why this is so important to our work, it's part of the guiding principles which we are required to follow from the Kellogg Foundation. And the first guiding principle is that there must be an accurate recounting of history, both local and national. A common prerequisite to an effective and enduring effort to achieve racial equity and healing is full and accurate knowledge of the role racism has played in the evolution of communities. So even though our name is Dallas Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, there's a very specific reason why that is the order. We can't skip to the transformation part without talking about the truth, and with that comes narrative change and language. So just so that we have an understanding and we're using the same terminology, and feel free to jump in the chat if you have questions. Race is a political construction created by European anthropologists, scientists, and philosophers. Race is a false hierarchy of social and human value. It is not an ethnicity, not based in science. It's not natural. It's a rather new idea. It's set in stone and it's fluid, meaning that depending on what's happening in the world and who has power, the race can shift, but the traditional top and bottom of the hierarchy stays the same. It's also not nationality, so it's not the country that you are from or born in. Racism. There is no such thing as reverse racism. Racism is a complex system of beliefs, practices, and behaviors based on the false premise of white racial supremacy and inferiority of all others. But the most important thing is that you have to combine it with power in order for it to be racism. So we all have prejudice, and prejudice is unfounded beliefs plus irrational fear. And so we can be prejudiced and biased against the things that are unknown to us. But if we don't have the institutional power to impact someone's lives or their outcomes, then it's not racism. There's 4 different levels of racism. internalized and interpersonal, which are individual forms of racism. And then we have the larger systemic racism, institutionalized and structural. It's in everything and everywhere in the US, and it's not going to die out with older generations. And malice is not required for racism to occur. So I always say that impact is more important than an intent. A lot of us say that, you know, we're not racist because, or we don't do racist things, but we still benefit from a racist system. And so racism is still occurring. Racial equity is the process and outcome that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicated in a statistical, I think it's supposed to be predicted, but in a statistical sense, how one fares. And then racial justice is a proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunities, treatment, impacts, and outcomes for everyone. Racial healing, which brings us to today, is a process that restores individuals and communities to wholeness, repairs the damage caused by racism, and transforms societal structures into ones that affirm the inherent value of all people. It benefits all people because regardless of background, we are all living in and impacted conditions present throughout this increasingly interconnected, racialized world. But though it has benefits for all people, what we want to be careful of is using racial healing as a band-aid or skipping the steps and calling for unity without the accountability and without going back to the truth and the reality of what brought us here today. So healing is not the toxic positivity that we often see when people are trying to subdue people's complaints about racism and their lived experiences. You know, we should all be united, all lives matter. Toxic positivity in a response to someone's lived experiences about racism can lead to questioning reality, feeling invalidated, or trying to shut off your emotions because of shame. We see this, the media loves stories about this sort of toxic positivity. We've seen a lot with elections, neighbors and families who are able to still love each other despite these like huge gaps in values. And anyone that is speaking out about injustice needs to just love their neighbor and move forward and find common ground. And that doesn't actually acknowledge the real systemic issues that we're facing. Our special speaker this morning, Nicole Hannah-Jones, recently on MSNBC said, "We've seen through history that calls for unity usually come at the expense of Black citizens." So I like to respond to people with this quote: "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." From artist and activist Lila Watson. So if you truly believe that that unity is possible, it's only because you understand the injustice and the oppression that we have gone through, and you're willing to work through that with us. Some of the things that we often hear when it comes to racism are euphemisms, racial undercurrent, racially tinged, racial provocateur, race-based, when we really mean racist or racism. So we're going to be really clear when we talk about racism in the media, in our conversations, in the work that we do. It's actually part of the Associated Press's style book now. Anytime journalists are talking about race-related coverage, they are to not use racially charged, racially motivated, racially tinged, if the terms racist and racism are truly applicable. So Mississippi has a history of racist lynchings, not racially motivated lynchings. Another phrase that people have started to use instead of talking is minority, which is not even going to be an actual thing in the future, especially in Dallas. By 2050, Black and Hispanic residents of Dallas County are projected to make up approximately 80% of Dallas County's population. Minority has the connotation of being less than. It's a way to minimize the lived experiences, that it's only happening to a small minority, and that's not accurate, and it's not the phrases that we use. But we also don't want to lump all of people of color together when what we really mean is Black people. And Nicole Hannah-Jones said this very eloquently this morning, that Black people have distinct experiences and distinct disadvantages. And so we have to be very clear when we're talking about those. We don't use Blacks. Black people is actually the phrase that we use, and we capitalize B. And this was something that people did not do in the media until recently. AP Stylebook changed their guide to capitalize B in June of 2020. So this is new, but it's also a sign that we can't wait for the mass media and the dominant culture to decide what's right and wrong to say. We have to lead by example, and they will follow. E-viewing took it a step further, and she was actually one of our guests last year, and she said that we can't just capitalize Black without capitalizing white. It's not an issue of respect or uplifting. Not capitalizing white reinforces the illusion of that whiteness is racelessness, and they are, to be fair, their own race with their own experiences now. And so we don't say Caucasian or Anglo-Saxon when we mean white people. Caucasian is a phrase that goes back to this sort of pseudoscience of Blumenbach, where he created this hierarchy of race and put himself and his European friends and family at the top as the most beautiful. Another phrase that you'll see in this is Oriental, when the phrase that we use is Asian American. We also want to be careful using Latino or Hispanic as a racial descriptor. Latinx people can be Black, white, Native, and or many other racial descriptors. We also at TRHT use the phrase American Indian and instead of Native and Indigenous. This was actually something that has come up in our friends from the American Indian Heritage Day of Texas told us that that's how they preferred to be referred as. And self-identification is so important. Whatever categorization, wherever categorizations and labels are used to oppress groups of people, self-identification becomes an act of resistance. So if there's ever a question of how to refer to someone or what to call them or how to name someone, asking them what they prefer is the most powerful thing that you can do. It's a very difficult thing to know what the right thing to say is, and things are changing all of the time, but it's very important to try. Instead of falling back on safety words. And by those, I mean the ones that we see in all of the nonprofit mission statements and headlines when people are talking about nonprofit or charity work: inner city, disadvantaged, working poor, at risk, low income, when what people really need to talk about is the community they're serving and who that's impacting. There was a study done looking at how many times at-risk youth was used in a scholarly search engine on Google. There's countless articles, documents, images with that phrase in it. And the reason that people use at-risk is because they're talking about, they go back to low socioeconomic status. It's about income. It's about helping communities that are impoverished or under-resourced. But there's this thing called the culture of poverty, and it's the notion that poor and working class people are poor because they don't know how to work, they don't have the motivation to work, or they're too dependent on public assistance, that it's intergenerational, and this is based on racism. So in 1965, Senator Moynihan authored a report called The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, and stated in the report that poor Blacks in the United States were caught in a tangle of pathology, the core reason for which was the breakdown of the Black family, specifically the decline of the traditional male-headed household, resulting in a deviant matriarchal family structure. We see this even locally. This is the Goals for Dallas from the 60s. J. Eric Johnson, the mayor, created this, where he said that Negroes, many have incomes ranging from $2,000 down. and blames it because they don't have recreation, they don't go to church, they don't have a job. The racial wealth gap today, or in 2016, for example, at $171,000, the net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times greater than that of a Black family. And it has nothing to do with the culture of poverty or the myths that we have told about Black people or people that are in poverty. This is another look at the racial wealth gap for visual learners from the 80s to current times. This is a comparison of the racial wealth gap post-Civil War to today, and nothing has changed since then. Dallas is one of the worst examples of a racial wealth gap in the country. We have a segregation problem that Jerry has addressed in all of our history presentations, the worst income equality by neighborhood in the US, ranked dead last in the study of economic inclusivity, the highest child poverty rate. So a lot of the work that people do in the city is because of these issues, because of the wealth gap. But instead of naming racism as the cause of that, we label the people that we're serving. The discourse of risk ignores institutionalized structures of inequality and a systemic analysis of what places people at risk. So for example, a very prominent nonprofit in the area, Cafe Momentum, gets a lot of press, and the headlines say rioters damage Dallas restaurant that employs at-risk youth, restaurant that employs at-risk youth turning tough time into promise, families in need, at-risk youth. And we see this over and over. And it's hard. Reclaiming power from racist systems takes a willingness to come to the conversation with curiosity and openness, and a willingness to get it wrong. And sometimes we don't know what to say. And at risk sounds like the buzzword, and it moves donors who want to help. And we have to do better. For example, D Magazine did an article in June where they said at-risk youth plucked from the juvenile detention system. But when they had a conversation, which they were open to after I tweeted about the language that they used, they actually corrected it and put a correction at the bottom of the article to explain what they learned and why they are going to do better moving forward. Another question that we get when we talk about not using things like at risk is, what do we do instead? And so some of us put out this people first language concept, and it's where you avoid labeling individuals altogether. So at its core, person first language seeks to acknowledge the inherent and equal value of every individual before attaching any other descriptors or identities that the person may view as secondary or non-intrinsic. It begins with empathy. So we're not going to use euphemisms like at promise, at hope. We're not replacing all of those negative things with something that sounds better, because it's still a label, it's still a euphemism. The people who are being labeled and who are reading the label still know what you're sort of covering and trying to gloss over. Valerie Strauss wrote about this in the Washington Post. While well-intended, the problem I see with it is that it could easily be seen as a condescending euphemism for the term it was meant to replace. So what that looks like in practice is, instead of saying something like disadvantaged youth, you say young people experiencing educational disadvantage. And then you take it a step further and describe what that disadvantage is and why it exists. And the answer is always racism. Resources for at-risk students would be resources to reduce risk factors for students. You're taking the burden off of the person, off of the young person, off of the person experiencing whatever it is that you're discussing. Because consistently defining people in denigrating terms is one way that racist narratives become institutionalized and part of the culture. It's why when you hear at risk and low income, you can instantly picture somebody and you can imagine what race they are, but we're not saying it. The dominant media is itself a tool of white supremacy. So we saw how those headlines are ubiquitous. And when it comes to media on a national level, especially in times like these where we're seeing police brutality and violence and murder, the media will use phrases like officer-involved shooting and switch to passive voice when a Black man is shot by a white vigilante or police officer. Shots were fired. We see it in how we treat our Black victims versus our white suspects. So Black victims are blamed, are criminalized for being Black. Trayvon Martin was suspended 3 times from school. Slain Lake Lentine had been shot before. Death was possibly drug related. And then the white suspects, brilliant but social misfit, brilliant athletic, but his demons were the death of his parents. Oregon school shooting subject was fascinated with guns, but was a devout Mormon, his friends say. Soft-spoken, polite, a gentleman. This is in the imagery that we see on the news as well. White suspects are shown with their school photos or their uniforms, and instead of their mugshots. We see it even covering natural disasters. After Hurricane Katrina, a young man is looting a grocery store. A similar image from the same natural disaster, Hurricane Katrina, of 2 white passing residents finding bread and soda. They were resourceful. It was necessary. We're seeing it a lot today with what happened, the insurrection at the Capitol, false equivalence. So we're basically, people are comparing the Black Lives Matter protests or demonstrations to what happened at the Capitol. This is false equivalence, setting up 2 opposing sides of an argument and making it look like they hold equal weight when really they don't. The tendency to describe violent behavior as just a pro-Trump rally. We saw this, I think, float more in the beginning and definitely from right-leaning news sources. It's something that's been studied as the protest paradigm. Scholars James Hertog and Douglas McLeod identified how news coverage of protests contributes to the maintenance of the status quo. So media narratives tend to emphasize the drama, inconvenience, disruption of protests, rather than the demands and grievances and the agendas of protesters. We saw that a lot this summer with Black Lives Matter protests. And then on the flip side, when it comes to the conservative and the right-leaning protests, they overemphasize the spectacle. It's why we saw this image of the guy wearing this hat and the face paint, and it sensationalizes it to a point where it almost makes it seem like a joke, like trivialized, instead of the terrible treasonous act that it was. The news outlets are doing better because we're at a point where they know they have to now. New York Times, Trump incites mob, Trump mob storms Capitol, mob storms Capitol. We're at a point where we can't sugarcoat anything anymore, and they realize that they've been complicit, and it's time to start fixing that and correcting it. Texas papers were more likely to write positively about protests related to health and immigration compared to those about racism. If you take a look at how they categorized it. The substance of some marches got more play than others. Around half of the reports on anti-Trump protests, immigration rallies, women's rights included substantial information about the grievances and demands. But in contrast, protests related to the Dakota Access Pipeline and anti-Black racism only got legitimizing coverage less than 25% of the time. They were more likely to be described as disruptive and confrontational. It's really important who gets quoted, whose story is being told. In Texas, most of the news was not balanced. for some types of protests, official sources appeared more often, and protesters were given more space in other examples. So for anti-Black racism protests, only 23% were led by sort of the narrative of the protesters and what they were demanding. Oppressive language does more than represent violence. It is violence. It does more than represent the limits of knowledge. It limits knowledge. The media has sort of taken the stance that they are neutral and that they are just observing and reporting on facts, but the things that we're seeing and were in the previous slide has contributed to the violence against people, and it's time to take note of that. And some of them are. This is an example of a headline from the 1980s in the Los Angeles Times: "Marauders from inner city prey on LA suburbs." The LA Times have actually decided to go through and learn more about their history of racism in their own institution and their own newspaper. They are doing a special series. That slide is actually for the Kansas City Star, who is doing the same thing. The Truth in Black and White: An Apology from the Kansas City Star. These newspapers have realized now how much damage has been done. They are reporting on themselves and researching some of these racist stories and headlines that they've done and trying to correct it. The LA Times wrote, "Prompted by a pandemic, an economic crisis, and a national debate over policing, all of which have spotlighted racial disparities in the United States, our nation now faces a long-delayed reckoning with systemic racism. We would be remiss in the autumn of 2020, a season of grief and introspection, if we did not take part in that self-examination." So that editorial was part of that process. An example that they gave was in the 1990s with the Rodney King beating and the unrest that followed. They actually got a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage. But in later years, academics argued that the Times overemphasized the role of Black residents in the riots and sensationalized the Black-Korean conflict, especially after the Korean-born shopkeeper Soon Ja-du had killed a Black teenager. So they're looking at really specific incidences and starting to take accountability for the narrative that they created. This is from another style guide section from Some of Us. A main goal should be to tell stories from the perspective of the community being represented, rather than telling the story through the lens of the dominant power brokers, which is a very important goal, but one that's challenging. New York Times did a really incredible report on how many people in power are white versus people of color. And in the publishing industry, out of the 15 people that direct major news organizations, only 3 are Black or Hispanic. The 5 people who have the most influence over book publishing are all white. And the people who edit the 10 most read magazines are all white. So when we talk about getting stories from the community and being told by the people who are experiencing them, there is a very large barrier to overcome, because the people who are deciding the headlines, deciding who gets to write, who gets hired, do not look like the communities that they're describing. And so that brings me to my work, why I do what I do. I want to give a very important plug to the Op-Ed Project, a nonprofit in New York, who I was part of their Public Voices Fellowship in Dallas. The reason I'm bringing it up is because they are accepting applications right now for their next cohort. Applications are due on the 25th, but I'll be happy to send information to anyone who's interested in applying. It's for women, and specifically women of color, who want to have their stories told and amplify their thought leadership. The fellowship is 3 months long, and it's based around learning how to submit an op-ed. So what they realized was that most op-eds published in major newspapers are by white men, and men predominantly, 9 out of 10. But then when they looked at who was pitching, most of their pitches, 9 out of 10, were from men. And so they're working on increasing the number of pitches from women and who gets published in op-eds, and then what can come out of an op-ed. And on that same note, after the fellowship, or actually during the fellowship, I was inspired to create my own online publication when I realized how difficult it was to have your story told and to have your op-ed published in some, especially our local newspapers. And so I created Visible. So if anybody has an interest in writing or sharing their story, I would love to start by publishing it there as well. Why I do what I do, why this is so important to me, and why narrative change is such a critical component of TRHT's work. I think this quote by a professor, Robert McKee, sums it up very well. Storytelling is the most powerful way to put ideas into the world. Unfortunately, as we know, with great power comes great responsibility, and it is on us to hold people accountable for the way they tell the stories and who tells those stories and the language that is used in the stories. And I think we are about 15 minutes out, so I would love to give time for questions for anyone that has them. I didn't get a chance to monitor the chat while we were talking, so I'll scroll through now.
Stephanie, you are absolutely amazing. Just saying that. I told you all that she would be, and Visible Magazine actually published Little Old Me for an article, and I'm so far from being a writer. So I'm going to start out with a question for you, Stephanie. So in your experience, especially during these COVID times, do you see a heightened amount of responsibility coming from white media when it comes to how they're reporting, and what does it look like? What does it look like to you?
So one thing that I've seen, especially in COVID time, and I left some slides out for time, is the anti-Asian racism that has come out because of the pandemic. And you see it in Trump's tweets and the references to the China virus, and the direct correlation and the increase in anti-Asian racism and violence that came after that. And the media has, obviously, they are going to report the things that Trump says and some of them have even done commentary, and they are not condoning it. But the images that they choose to put with the headlines, the number of articles that talked about COVID that had a picture of an Asian or an Asian person wearing a mask or kind of being the subject of it, that just, and it was a very easy thing to do when the president of the United States was calling it the China virus. Some of that implicit and explicit bias, and it takes some extra thought. Maybe it's harder to find an image of a white person wearing a mask. At least it was in that time. But those are really intentional things and choice points that editors and reporters have to think about now.
So then I have another question. When someone is in a place of, writing a press release, and they get to a place of being confused about how to identify individuals, like, what is your suggestion to them on how they sort of go about making sure that they're doing it right or doing it equitably?
So my advice would always be to kind of dissect it yourself. If you start with something and like at-risk youth, like you start with wanting to talk about the work that you do and the language that you use is at risk or marginalized, I would have them kind of analyze what's the breakdown of who you serve, what's the age, what are the zip codes that you're serving, and what is the race, and what is the difference, and be very explicit in why that's who you're serving. So if you're serving students in South Dallas and they are primarily Black and brown, why is it that your work is needed so much in South Dallas? Why did you choose as an organization to serve South Dallas? And use the space in the press release where you would normally talk about how you change the lives of these people to amplify the problem. Racism, segregation, redlining has caused this inequity, and it is directly harming Black families, and the work that we're doing is to repair that. We're not coming in and saving lower income students. We are addressing a problem that was caused by racism and is exacerbated by racism continuing today. Yes, Annie says the savior complex informs. So a lot of people lead with the work that they're doing rather than why the problem exists and continues.
Yeah, absolutely. So 2 questions have come up. Teresita asks, what is the difference between POC and BIPOC? If you say POC are only Black and we shouldn't say Indigenous, how are Latinx that are more white passing and Asians go in the BIPOC definition?
I think as an Asian, I'm in the latter half, the people of color. And yes, the Indigenous, we have learned, is not the preferred language. So I have, when it's appropriate to say people of color, I usually lean with that. But like Nicole Hannah-Jones said, there are things that impact Black people specifically. So I think my advice would always be to think about exactly who you're trying to talk about and not use it as a blanket statement. So if it is something that is just impacting non-traditionally white dominant culture, then people of color. But if you really are talking about something like police brutality, where it is impacting Black people in a very different way, then separating that would be ideal.
Absolutely. So when you are talking about perhaps a group of Latinx, Black, American Indian, that's the appropriate time to do it. Okay, so David Gruber says, and I think most of this is a statement, and then he gets to a question. Interestingly, when the city of Dallas discusses sweeps of encampments of persons experiencing homelessness, they use the sanitized language of encampment resolution. Is it a coincidence that 65 to 70% of those resolved are Black?
No, that's not.
No.
That's an example of oppressive language, like being oppression. That is, it is equating Black people with a problem to be resolved and eradicated and fixed, and it's racist.
Right. Okay. Are there any more questions out there for Stephanie, the awesome and amazing one? I didn't see any more.
I want to highlight what Amy said, that self-identification is regionally defined. Yes, best to ask. That slide I had on self-identification, when in doubt, ask the person, and which is really the crux of this from the people first, is that you're not putting a label on someone. You are empowering them. They are people first with their own preference on how they want to be referred.
Absolutely. So we have come to the end of another amazing session. Big applause for Stephanie. She is also the backstage technical person for this entire conference. So we got to pull her away, but she is anxiously waiting to go back to what she was doing before. Stephanie, we do offer consultations. I just saw this come up. For nonprofits and businesses on storytelling equitably, as well as training and one-on-one cohort. So I would love to follow up with you. And if you're interested in that, you can reach out to me at this email address. I'm pulling it as Stephanie. That's what I'm doing right now. And I'll be glad to get back with you. Y'all listen, we have 2 more sessions. Really excited about the next session that's starting at 2:00. So you'll leave out of the breakout and go back to the main stage, and we'll be back online at 2, and then we will wrap up at 2:45 with Jerry doing Dallas Vision 2.0. So thank you again, Stephanie. You're getting lots of applause in the chat. We will see you the backstage and in the background as the TRHT team. And thank you all for participating. And just being a part of all that we're doing for National Day of Racial Healing. Have a great one. Take good care.
See you on social.